All right, to conclude our lecture series for this week, let's talk about the concept of white privilege. So, white privilege refers to the benefits that people receive simply by being part of the dominant racial group in society, in this case, for being white. All right, it's important to note, this is very important, that access to white privilege is not necessarily determined by whether you identify as a white person. Access to white privilege is often determined by how others label or assign meaning to your race. So again, this is a very symbolic interaction idea here, right? It's the meaning that we assign to things, to symbols, in this case, to skin tone. So for example, I may be a white person, but if my skin tone is dark, people may label or treat me as a racial minority. So similarly, a person who identifies as a racial minority may have very fair skin. It may be labeled and treated as a white person, right? So this happened to me a lot. I am white. I'm completely Caucasian of descent. All my ancestors came from Caucasia. But in the summer times, especially if I spend a lot of time outside, I do have fairly dark complected skin, and it gets even darker as I'm in the sun. My skin tans very dark, and oftentimes I'll have people come up to me out of nowhere, strangers who I don't even know, asking me what my ethnicity is, asking me what my race is, or come up and start speaking to me in Spanish or in some other language because they make assumptions about my race or ethnicity based solely off my skin tone. All right, so the way we're treated in certain interactions and the way we are able to access white privilege really is largely dependent on other people's perceptions of us in any given situation. By and large, whiteness or being white affords a lot of unearned benefits and advantages to people, again, because of the institutional racist history of our society. Now, white people do not like hearing that they get our privilege because of their skin color. We don't. It gets us upset, we get uncomfortable, we start feeling guilty and ashamed and all of those negative things, and our immediate response to the phrase white privilege is to put up a wall and get defensive. And this is something that we need to work to fight against. Instead of getting defensive when we're accused or asked or to think about having white privilege, why not take some time and reflect on how our white privilege has affected our lived circumstances today. All right. This is something else that's really important that I don't think many white people fully grasp. All right. Having a white privilege does not mean that every aspect of our life is sunshine and rainbows. Many white people may still live in poverty and live paycheck to paycheck and experience systemic or structural oppression for other facets of their life. But this does not erase the many unearned advantages being white affords an individual, all right? White privilege means that the color of your skin is never going to structurally disadvantage you in our society. Your likelihood of being considered for a job or getting admitted to a school or the quality of healthcare you receive or being gunned down by a police officer is not going to be significantly negatively impacted by your white skin, the way that those same behaviors are negatively impacted for people of color. All right. You know, a lot of people will hear this and say, well, I had an uncle a white uncle who grew up in poverty and now he's a millionaire and the owner of his own business. So how did he have white privilege? Well, he had white privilege because being white didn't hold him back from experiencing any of the growth or advancement that he had in his life, the same way that a person of color would be held back because of the various forms of institutionalized racism that we've already talked about in these lectures, right? Similarly, I mean, I'm a white person, I'm a white man in society, and in the United States, that gives me a hell of a lot of privilege and power in my positionality. But I am also a first-generation college student. I am also a member of the LGBT plus community. So I still experience structural oppression and discrimination and prejudice for certain aspects of my identity, but I do not experience it because of my race, right? Or because of my gender. I experience a lot of advantages, unearned benefits because of my whiteness. Now, this week, I also asked you to read one of the most famous writings on white privilege, one of the seminal works in this area by Peggy McIntosh, which is Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, wherein she discusses the many ways that white privilege sometimes isn't even about affording specific benefits to white people. It's just the simple inconveniences that white people don't have to endure that people of color have to experience on a daily basis. So let's take a look at some examples of what white privilege is. Peggy McIntosh referenced many of these in her article, so I'll just highlight a few additional ones and repeat some of them here. For me personally, white privilege is being able to go shopping without having a sales associate keep an eye on me because I look like a potential shoplifter. Being white and having white privilege is finding my hair care products in the hair care aisle of the store rather than having to find the ethnic hair care section if the store even carries hair care products designed for people with textured hair, specifically designed towards people of different races and ethnicities other than white folks. White privilege is being able to easily find a flesh tone Band-Aid in any first aid kit that I open. White privilege for me is being able to walk down the sidewalk without having people cross to the other side of the street out of fear that I'm going to mug them. White privilege for me is accurately learning about the history of my race in school and consistently seeing my race represented in all my textbooks. I don't know if you can see the shirt I'm wearing today, but it lists the names of many prominent figures of African American history, and many of whom aren't even mentioned in our textbooks today, again, because a lot of the education that we're taught as children was produced by white people through the lens of white American history. White privilege to me is frequently seeing and hearing my race speaking as a voice of authority in politics, in education, in every institution in the United States. White privilege for me is not having the fear of potentially being shot by a police officer if I get pulled over for a routine traffic violation. White privilege for me is knowing that just because Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer were rapists and serial killers, other people won't automatically assume that I and all of my white male friends are rapists and serial killers as well. White privilege for me is having great grandparents who are legally allowed to own property and establish wealth in this country that they could pass down to my parents and subsequently to myself. White privilege to me is having the ability to choose to remain willfully ignorant to systemic racism because it will never affect me personally in a negative way. This is what white privilege looks like. It's not just about the unearned advantages that we receive as white people in the United States. It's about all of the simple things that we take for granted that we don't have to experience as inconveniences. Things like being watched in a store when we're shopping, or have people deliberately walk to the other side of the street because they're afraid that they're going to get mugged, right? Those are things that I, as a white person, have never had to experience. Now imagine experiencing those subtle forms of microaggressions every single day. Imagine the exhaustion. Imagine the physical and mental and psychological strain that it would have unequivocally on your health, your physical and mental health. Imagine the frustration and the anger that would be built up by constantly being exposed to these simple forms of oppression and discrimination. And we wonder as a society why these protests are taking place around the world. You wonder why some of them have turned into violent riots. Wouldn't you be fed up after hundreds of years of experiencing this type of policing, prejudice, and discrimination, of constantly seeing your people being killed and mistreated, of dealing with these small, subtle inconveniences and annoyances day in and day out, only to have nothing being addressed at the structural level? Wouldn't you get a little pissed off too, right? So this is what we can do as white people in our society. We can reflect on how we experience these advantages that we take for granted every single day, because it's so easy to take for granted the benefits or the privileges that we're exposed to because they're just around us like water to a fish. We just think it's part of the normal life. Imagine if you had even half of these small privileges taken away from you. Imagine how annoying and frustrating that would become in your everyday life. right? That's what I ask you all to do in this class, to reflect on this, because again, to shift from being not racist to anti-racist requires us to take this action to acknowledge the existence of racism in our society today and the deleterious, the harmful consequences it has on people of color. This is something that affects all of us as society. We all have something to benefit as society, white people included, by getting rid of racism. All right, so what can people do? Specifically, what can us white people do? All right. Now, there's an excellent source called Teaching Tolerance. It's a group of educational and informative resources that's funded through the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a great organization that works to fight structural racism and inequality by providing racial justice towards racial minorities in America. So I definitely encourage you to check out this link. But first and foremost, my first piece of advice to us fellow white people is to not take it personally or to use discomfort as an excuse to disengage from uncomfortable conversations about race and racism. If our instincts tell us it's more important to retreat or to reassure ourselves that we're not racist, let's pause and take a minute to reflect and instead think, what actions can I take to help? Again, we got to lean into this discomfort and question our history, question what is happening at the structural level in the society that we're a part of, and do what we can to lean into that discomfort and recognize how we may be contributing to these problems, even if it's at the subconscious level. Another critically important thing that we can do as white people in this fight against institutionalized racism is to educate ourselves. And you're doing that by being part of this class, by listening to this video lecture, by reading through this content, by watching the videos that were posted this week. You're educating yourself and you're doing something. You are engaging in an anti-racist behavior at this very moment. So just as we shouldn't expect people of color to take the lead on speaking out against racism, you should not expect them to educate you. As individuals, we all should take ownership of our own education right now. We're all adults now, right? While it's okay to ask people of color who have expressed a willingness to answer them, you can ask questions of people of color about racism. Maybe you don't understand how racism affects people of color specifically in the United States or in a particular geographic region, and you want to better understand that. You can ask people who have willingly expressed a voluntariness, who have volunteered to share their experiences with you. You can ask them about that, but you shouldn't expect people of color to have to teach you about racism, right? We can educate ourselves. We can read, watch, or listen to articles, books, documentaries, or podcasts on race or racism. There are thousands of them, and I'd be happy to direct you to these resources, especially those that are being produced by people of color. Again, I can't recommend this book enough, How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. Dr. Kendi's work is brilliant, and there's many other resources I'd be happy to share. If this is a topic you're interested in, shoot me an email and let me know, and I will get you access to some of these other resources so you can further your knowledge and then become a catalyst to positive change by educating other people in your family, your friends, who you think would benefit from being more informed about race and racism in the United States. And lastly, learn when to listen, learn when to amplify, and learn when to speak up. And this is a video clip that I included in the content for this week, showing how white people, as people who experience privilege being part of the dominant race group in the United States, we can stand up against racial injustices when they happen. We can stand up and be allies to people of color and to use the privilege and the power that we are afforded because of our skin color, because of our whiteness and being in that dominant group, to further advocate for social reform that aligns with anti-racist pedagogy and logic. So let people of color speak. White people should not be dominating conversations about race or questioning the experiences of people of color. Instead, let's use our own white privilege to amplify the voices of people of color. Share the work of people of color on social media. Read and cite the scholarship that is produced by scholars of color. However, white people should, like I said, speak up if you see or hear racist behaviors or remarks. It should not be the sole responsibility of people of color to intervene when offensive things are said or done. We can all use our white privilege to take a stand against racial injustice, and it can start this very moment.